This is the book we are launching, Love and Its Seasons. It's a collection of short stories by Aamer Hussein. Aamer has some copies of the book with him for sale because it has not yet been released in Pakistan. So if anybody would like a copy, to buy a copy, you should see Aamer after the session. I'm told that we are going for an hour because the other launch that was supposed to happen in this room is not happening today. So we will have a spacious amount of time to actually talk and discuss and respond to Aamer's work. But before,
I hope you'll have lots of questions.
Yes, I hope you have lots of questions too. But before we begin, I thought that, I thought that Aamer might read a selection from the new collection so you get a sense of his work, what his themes, his ideas, his concerns, and the absolute exquisite beauty of his writing.
Thank you. Thank you, Framji. Has it gone off again? Is it on? Yeah. Okay, as you see, this is a tiny collection, and my publisher is a poet. And in fact, she describes these stories not as stories, but as proems, which is short for prose poems. I don't write poetry, but I probably love poetry more than I do anything else, and storytelling, so hopefully there's a combination of the two. These stories are very short. Many of them are inspired by fables, some of them by Maulana Rumi, some by Attar. Some are true stories. Perhaps I'll read an excerpt of one of those later as well. One is taken from my mother's diary, others are stories that have been told to me. So these are stories basically that I've borrowed from life around me as well as from other books. And it was a pleasure and a delight to do that. I'll read you a story called The Hermitage, and you can guess where it's set, and I'll tell you later. I won't give away the roots of the story. Mridul, the young monk, arrived at the hermitage on the hill while Abbot Siddhant was meditating after his midday meal. Mridul had walked up the mountain path for miles, from the monastery in the forest to which Siddhant had sent him 3 months ago as an observer after his arduous training. Mridul drank a glass of water and ate a bowl of boiled rice as he waited for his teacher. "What brings you here?" the abbot asked his disciple after accepting his greeting. Mridul's forehead was furrowed, his lips dry. "There is a disturbance in the forest monastery," he said. "The nun Trishna has been ordered by Abbot Ajit to go into retreat." "What caused this?" Siddhant asked. "The congregation reported that she was singing with too much joy in her voice in the morning assembly," Mridul replied. And then Siddhant remembered when, many seasons ago, 20 or was it more, as abbot of the monastery in the forest, he had reprimanded Ajit for singing with too much authority in his voice, as if the singer, not the song, was of primary importance. Siddhant had put Ajit through various trials, and the young monk had put himself through mortifications until his song had fallen into silence, and then, when he regained his voice, into placid unison with the other singers of the congregation. And how many seasons had passed since Siddhant, taking with him only 3 disciples, had departed the forest for the cool air and harsher soil of the hills, leaving the forest monastery in the hands of his disciple Ajit, who better than anyone had known what it was to conquer his own arrogance? "I have heard," the abbot said, "that since Trishna arrived, too much time is given to singing in the forest monastery. That is what I sent you there to observe. And though I didn't expect to see you here quite so soon, you've done well to come back." That night, the 2 men set off on their trip to the monastery in the forest at the foot of the hill. They arrived after sunset the following day. After a night of scant rest, Siddhant took a place in the back of the reed-roofed hall in which the morning assembly was held. The gentle chant of the monks and the nuns took him deep into a well of emptiness, until he was pulled out of his silent reflection by a rich male voice rising and soaring above the other voices of the congregation. "That voice is the voice of the young Ajit," he said to himself, "but instead of the victorious tones of his younger days, he is singing now of longing and pain." But in his inner ear he heard the echo of another voice, that of a youth who, when he was meant to sing a hymn, had sung instead the words of a popular love song. And Siddhant saw in his mind's eye a form bowing from the waist, reflected in running water, Face tanned gold, great brown eyes, thick black hair coiled loosely on a golden nape, bare shoulders over a white sarong, feet dipping into moist soil, the form for which the youth had sung, instead of a hymn, a song of love. At a moment he considered opportune, when the monks had eaten their midday meal and gone into the forest to forage for roots and fruit, Siddhant called Ajit to him. They spoke in solitude all afternoon. The next morning, even before assembly, the monks and the nuns of the hermitage were in turmoil. Trishna ran away from her cell last night, Mridul told Siddhant when he emerged from his hut to see what the unseemly turbulence was about. It appears that she had spread powdered petals of the datura flower that causes sleep and sometimes causes death all around the dormitory so that no one would hear her leave. The nuns didn't wake until the sun rose, and when in fear we went to report her disappearance to Ajit, he too was gone. He left this for you. He handed Siddhant a sealed letter. Shall we go to look for them? No, Siddhant said, looking up without opening the letter. They have gone and will not come back. He tore open the letter, which he threw on the water of the river that ran nearby. Our work here is done, he said. Let us go. Leave the inhabitants here to choose who among them will guide them now. You may return with me to the top of the hill and the peace of our hermitage. Your apprenticeship here is over. Weeks went by. Mridul came back to the more rigorous life of the hermitage, surprising himself that he had adjusted with ease to the severity of this rocky place where vegetation was sparse and water had to be drawn from a well at dawn, after the relatively relaxed rules of the forest hermitage, where green plants, abundant fruit, and flowing water induced a torpor that made even the mortifications of the monks seem more like an interlude than a way of life. But one morning he became aware of a change that had been taking place in the air around him. Now there was a voice rising above the plaint chant of the other singers, rising, soaring, dipping, improvising, a voice with hoarse low notes, and clear plaintive upper notes. And he wondered how he could tell Siddhant that the voice he heard each morning, his master's voice, made his heart lurch, his limbs tremble, his tongue seek out new words and sounds, and his voice break with a yearning that until now, in his young life, he had never known.
Where is it set?
Now this is a great mystery. I was reading, of all things, the biography of a Thai nun. And this is a sequence set in the 1940s where a monk in the monastery where she was living decided to give up his post and get married to a nun and went off. So I decided to write it in a way that would leave it to you to decide what the landscapes were and where it was set. I thought it could be Thailand, it could be Burma, it could be Bangladesh, the Chittagong Hill Tracts. But I was in Islamabad with a Pakistani friend who's an Urdu poet, and she says, oh, the story is set in Taxila hundreds of thousands of years ago. Whereas it's actually, as far as I was concerned, set in the 40s of the last century. So stories can change shape according to the reader, which I find quite delightful. And I think that's a particular quality of the fable.
Okay. So actually, now that you've read it and they've heard it, so perhaps we can talk a little about when you write your prose poems, if someone could turn your phone off, the one that's ringing, thank you. When you write them, do you think of the writing in terms of rhythm and meter, and or do you simply write and then come back and revise in relation to the rhythms of the lines, the rhythms of the characters, and their spoken voice?
Well, this story came in a trance. It just came in one sitting. It was written the way it came. I hate that kind of mystic approach to writing, that it just descends on you and you succumb. But it does happen. It does happen. I'm rarely ever aware of looking for words or anything like that. I write the way I write, and then, yes, I do a little bit of editing later. But people keep asking me if I'm inspired by poetry in the sense that I want to write something poetic. No, I want to tell a story. I think poetry is for poets. For me, storytelling is the main thing, and that's what I was looking for in the story. Until the last minute, I didn't know what they were going to do, the monks. And then the young monks surprised me.
So I was reading actually this morning The Man Who Stood Still, and the opening sentences of A Man Who Stood Still really they struck me in the simplicity of the writing and the simplicity of the language, and that in that simplicity the words were so evocative that they evoked both images and sounds and resonances as I was reading. So if I just read your poem, The Man Who Ran Away. Yes, I recognize myself as the guest to whom, after too much champagne, at a party on the deck of a boat on the moonlit Bali Sea, with gilded butterfly dancers flitting around us, you told a story about a man who brought you close to death with his silences, his longing for someone who died. And there's a kind of really lilting quality to this and to the language, and at the same time, the language is really simple and really clear and clean, which brought up that question actually.
That I do aim for. I do aim to make it as simple as possible. So when people tell me I write complex sentences, it surprises me. But this story has a different genesis. It was actually written half the story was written in Urdu about 2 years before I wrote the English version. And it got abandoned for various reasons. And then one day I said, I have to finish the story. So I said, come on, just rewrite it in English. So that first half is very much actually inspired by the Urdu version.
Okay.
The other secret of the story is, of course, that the characters are called L and M. That lovely, resounding cliche, Jilar, Layla and Majnun. So it's part of the story is called The Madman and the Night, which is a literal translation of Layla is the night and Majnun is the madman. And it took 4 days to write. It was a very scary story to write. If you've read it, you possibly understand why. I mean, it's about a man who loses everything in the space of a night. So, yeah, it was very scary. Yeah, it's not an experience that I often have, but this was very frightening.
So much of your work, Aamer, is about, I wouldn't say, well, some of it is about unrequited love. Some of it is about lovers who simply miss each other, who could have but don't come together. Lovers who pine away for each other who almost literally kill each other in the process of loving each other.
Yeah. Leslie sighing.
And it's a kind of exquisite pain in your stories. That's the sense that I always got when I read them. Can you talk about that a little bit, about where that comes from?
I guess it comes from having studied Urdu and Persian poetry for a long time, being absorbed in various kinds of philosophical poets, in concepts of, life as exile. The opening passages of the Masnavi of Maulana Rumi, which says, we are reeds torn from the bed, and we kind of weep for our past and want to go back. I think it's all there. It's there in the unconscious. I don't consciously look for those themes. They just come that way.
Okay.
But yes, it is influences, I imagine.
And would you say Rumi is perhaps the biggest influence?
No, not the biggest, but he's been there for a long time, because I actually learned to read Persian by reading this verse. My mother taught me Persian, and it started with this, so it's always been there. And of course, you come to our own poets, Faiz Ahmed Faiz, for example. There's lots of unrequited love and longing there, and long nights of the soul, etc. And then it becomes also sometimes a metaphor for everything that is lacking in the human condition.
In that sense, I mean, your poems have a very Asian feeling to them, even though you have not lived in Pakistan or in South Asia for a very, very long time. Can you talk about writing from London about the world of South Asia, the rhythms, the resonances here?
It's not just South Asian. I think that at 30 I made a fairly conscious effort to read a lot of translations from Arabic, from Chinese, from Japanese, from Indonesian. My friend Hanan Shaykh's book, al-Shaykh's book, The Story of Zara, had a climactic sequence which was so influential that many years ago, later I found myself sort of semi-plagiarizing that with the description of a death, a long poetic description of a death. But I have to say, so I read all these, Najib Mahfouz, Pramodyanand Pator, various writers, and I've realized that the short story tradition was not the cut and dried European tradition that we'd been told to emulate. but there was a much longer tradition, going back to the 1001 Nights, going back to Qissa Jahad Darwish, the story before that.
Yeah, I remember when I read your work for the first time, I wrote you, or I told you, wrote. I said, Aamer, I think your book and your writing, it's like 1001 Night meets modern time. You are the modern time, and 1001 Night, the ancient time, but both of them are meeting each other. And
yes.
Yeah,
I was delighted because you were at the seaside on the south of France.
Yes.
And you read all those stories there, and you sent me a postcard, which I think I still have.
Oh, yeah. I was so happy to read Aamer in London, because here I am, exiled from Lebanon. Nobody forced me to be exiled, but I ran away, fled away from the war. And I wanted so much to be in the English culture in a way. And then when I read Aamer, I felt as if he's taking me by the hand to my mystics Arabic heritage when I read him. Yeah, it was such, I felt I was really cushioned by his writing. And since then we became best of friends, reading for each other. And I was the one who was really taking from him more than he was taking from me.
No, I think it goes both ways. But we tend to talk to each other a lot about short stories and themes that captivate us and so on as well. Yeah.
Aamer, you've written 2 novels, another Gulmohar Tree and The Cloud Messenger, but you always seem to come back to the short story as a form.
And they become shorter and shorter.
Yeah, and they become shorter and shorter.
Because you get wiser and wiser, maybe.
Well, I remember when you went off to the south of France that time, you said, I'm going to write very short stories. They're going to be 2 pages long. I'm sick of writing a long novel.
Yes.
I think you just finished Beirut Blues then. And I said, but I can't do this. And once or twice I would give Hanan a story to read, and she would say, look, I love this, but it needs to be 1/3 shorter. It's just rambling too much. And I would get really upset. When I did this book, she was the first to read it in draft, in manuscript, and she didn't say anything. I said, Hanan, you always told me to write short. Here's your book.
Now it's so short.
So the process of writing the novel, the process of writing the short stories, could you talk about the difference between the 2 of them?
Another Gulmohar Tree started as a long short story. I had started writing very long stories at that time. They were 20 or 30 pages long. And then another Gulmohar Tree grew and grew, and then a couple of people read it. You were away that summer, so you didn't read the original draft. You read it later. But people kept saying, look, this story covers a span of 10 years or perhaps 12. There are details in the characters' lives we'd like to know more about, like the wife is an artist. What was the Karachi art scene like? And I was, just old enough to remember. I was about 7 or 8 when people like Sadiq Khan and Anis Nagi and Leila Shahzada, your aunt, were painting. I remember them all. I knew them all. So I put that in. Details of life in PCHS, which the book is set in the 60s mostly, but I kind of backdated it to the 50s because I thought they won't be that different. And constantly worried that people who knew Karachi in the 50s will say, actually, no, he's writing about the 60s, but it's okay. I think that's allowed in fiction. So it was a story that outgrew itself. Then when it went to, I think when it went to my editor, it was complete and it had reached something like 17,000 words. And she said, look, this is a standalone if you add some short stories to it. A year later, when the book was about ready to go to press, I wrote the opening passages, which are actually a series of folk tales and mystic tales, and even an excerpt of the Quran woven together to form some kind of narrative about trust and the giving of gifts, I would say, and grace. Cloud Messenger was just, it was a short story, and then my publisher wanted another novel, and then it grew and grew, and it got longer, and it rambled, and I had to kind of follow chronologies, and I hated the process. And if I had the chance, I would either put that book away and forget it, or rewrite the whole thing, which I never will do. But so Gulmohar was a delight. Cloud Messenger was a torture. And Hanan hated the first draft. She liked the final one.
I love the final draft. Yeah, because you were working. I mean, at the first draft you were thinking what you want to write about, And then with the second one, you knew what you are
it was just the
going
bones
to
of the
write.
story.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
But
And
I
you're
guess
very patient, which is really good.
I
Patient.
needed the patience. I'm an impatient writer in the sense that I write a short story and I can take a month or 2 or 3 or 6 to complete it, to polish it. But it's done, the first draft, what I need to say is there already. Whereas in a novel, you're constantly looking for what's going to happen
Yes,
next.
yeah.
Yeah, it's not a process that makes me happy.
So the last story in Love and Its Seasons, which explicitly names the two lovers, makes me think that in some ways all of the short stories, all of the stories in this collection are really variations on the Leila Majnun story.
You could say that. Not always, but yeah, most of them are. And they're also specifically connected with singing or the human voice or sound in some way. Yeah.
Yes, singing.
Musical instruments.
There's singing in almost every single story.
Yeah.
There is music in every single story. And there is also a kind of characters who sing in the night, primarily, who lament in the night, primarily. So there's this connection between music, night, lamenting, grief, and Leila Majnun. Can you
and a kind of happiness as well.
And a kind of exquisite happiness and pain, right? So the happiness that comes, or rather, a joy that comes from an internalized pain or an internalized grief. Can you talk a little bit about the paradox of that, the contradictions that brings up, perhaps?
I don't know that there are any contradictions, because I think that you'll find in many of my stories the characters say that grief and joy are faces of the same emotion, or extremities, and so on and so forth. In The Lady of the Lotus, the woman who sings finds that singing is both painful and joyful for her. Sometimes she's in a situation where she transports the audience, but the audience doesn't make her transported. She comes away feeling disappointed. And this was one of the surprising things I found in my mother's diary, that she would sing and she would work hard to master a rag and then feel that she had not done her best and wanted to do better and better. When I asked her later what she wanted, she said, I always wanted the true note. And when I couldn't find it, I stopped singing. I think that that's got a lot to do with what happens in this book. The last story, again, came just as a kind of afterthought. The book was done. And there was this line that was just wandering around in my head, swimming around in my head from Persian. You need to look at Layla through Majnun's eyes. And I just wrote those 2 passages in pursuit of that. One is invented by me, and the other one is a direct, word-by-word paraphrase of Attar.
Okay. So it says, and all that is over now. Layla has become Majnun, and Majnun has become Layla. The madman and the night are submerged in each other. They are one and no longer two. So this coming together of the lovers as a single entity, as opposed to 2 separate entities. Is that perhaps the journey that the lovers aspire to, or that the goal that they aspire to?
Is it the journey the lovers aspire to, or is it the artist or the creator or the craftsman or the artisan trying to unite himself or herself with their art? I don't know. That's the question that's there for the reader. I would like the reader to be able to make her own interpretation every time, I think.
No, I remember when I was trying to retell 1001 Night for the theater. When there is the story, the 3 ladies, there were 3 girls, 3 sisters, and then the Caliph and his Caliph Harun al-Rashid and his Wazir, Minister Ja'far al-Barmaki, heard singing from while they were walking, and of course the Sultan Harun al-Rashid was disguised, and he didn't want anyone to know who he was, but he wanted to know how his kingdom and how his people are living. Yes. And I remember when I was reading this, I immediately thought of Aamer, because at the house, and I told him, because in the house of these 3 women, there were everything. There were joy, there were singing, and there were tragedies, sadness, and it's all the elements of life were in that evening. And there were 3 dervishes who came as well, and they were everyone had to tell his story. miserable story and joyful story. And I thought of Aamer when I was reading it, and I said, I have to tell him, because his writing, it combines everything. It's for the mystic, you know, relying on mysticism unconsciously, subconsciously, yes. There is singing and there is lamenting at the same time. It's like birds and, yeah.
In a sense, you know, when I was reading A Thousand and One Nights of your book, the sense I got from actually, in the sense of Aamer's work as well, is that there's a kind of when lovers in your novels, in your short stories, when they are in love, they, in a sense, completely shut out everything except the image or the voice or the sound of the love object. That there is a kind of hermeticism involved in the act of loving. Would you say that you think of it that way?
Yeah.
Both of you, actually?
Sometimes it can be unfortunate, because what you do is you enclose yourself with the memory of that love in order to recreate it in art. And you don't live it out in real life. But of course, sometimes, you know, you have the grace to be able to live it out in real life as well. But I don't know that it lasts for more than 5 minutes at a time. So.
Yeah, well, in Thousand of and One Night, when I was working on it, I felt the same. But in my fiction, I don't think I would adopt this tone of voice, and yes, more practical.
In the novels, I mean, you have two completely different relationships, because in Another Gul Mohat Tree, there's very much a kind of secular, if you like, relationship of a man and a woman who have a long marriage, and each one thinks the other one is bored with the other, but then they come together. But it's the man who realizes that he hasn't been seeing. You know, blindness becomes a metaphor, and that's a line from Ghalib. You know, Chashm ko chahiye har rang mein baho jana. You need to open your eye on every color. Because he realizes that he's not been seeing the richness of those colors and textures of life. Whereas she always has. She's just unconsciously bounced along, enjoying everything that comes her way. The Cloud Messenger is really about renunciation. And renunciation doesn't mean, just as you saw in that story, The Hermitage, which I read out to you, it doesn't necessarily mean giving up the world. What I think that the narrator, protagonist of The Cloud Messenger realizes that he can live without love. He can live with the memory of love, but then love becomes a wider thing. So that friendship and familial relationships, also in Another Gul Mohat Tree, and love of the world and love of everything is there with him, but he's basically solitary, and he realizes that being solitary is not a sin, it's not a crime, and it's not a burden.
In The Swan's Wife, which is a previous collection of Aamer's, you actually allude to the short story in terms of the miniature painting, and especially in terms of the Mughal miniature.
Yeah, the tree at the limit. Yeah.
Can you talk, have you been inspired by miniature paintings, by Mughal miniatures?
Definitely, but all kinds of painting. I mean, that story is also inspired by the paintings of an artist called Esther Rahim, who's a Pakistani, German, Austrian Pakistani artist. It's inspired by surrealist painters of the time. It's inspired by the history of the time. It's inspired by the fear of rising censorship in Pakistan, etc. It's set in Ayub's time, etc. So there's a lot happening there, but it is all told as a series of images. I think at that time, in that book, the visual image, whether it was a moving visual image, a cinematic image in another story, or a still visual image, are the central and guiding metaphor of the book. Just in the same way as in this new book, it's sound and voice. But those themes emerge as I write. You know? A third story, a fourth story, I follow a particular line and suddenly realize that I'm constantly pursuing one particular trope.
Do you think you want to have a unity for the book, or that's why?
Echoes.
Echoes.
I just like to have echoes from one story to another. So you might read two stories in between which seem to have nothing to do with each other, and then you read the fourth, and it'll harken back to the first, and the stories in between will talk to those as well. Yes. I hope it happens that way. But it doesn't have to. I think you can read the story separately.
Better not to have a unity. Then you will be obliged to, to just you are obliged to sometimes write something you don't feel it
That's
so
right, yeah.
so much.
To create an artificial
yes,
unity,
artificial
yeah.
way of
Yeah.
yes.
But you've often told me when you've read my collections, because I always tell you, Hanan, you've read all the stories already, but you read the collection, you come back to me and you say it had more depth and density when you read it as a collection. So
Yeah,
something happened.
I think the image of an echo, the metaphor of an echo is a really nice metaphor for your work because it's not just among stories in a collection, but I think across your entire I mean, from the first stories. I mean, the ones in Pakistan.
Yeah, some of these are from
yeah.
the early 80s, and these are the stories that Hanan first read and said, this is a book. I mean, the first 9 or 10 of them, I think.
But really, there's a kind of echo all the way from the early stories all the way to the current collection, the new collection, and I think that there's a coherence to the world that you create in your works and in the stories that in fact all of the stories inhabit one world, and that they, even if that world over time seems to have changed or seems to have shrunk in size in terms of the length of the stories, perhaps, that they resonate against each other in really interesting ways, some discordant, some harmonious ways, but they do resonate.
I like the discordant.
Yeah, and the discord is as much part of the experience of the stories that. What are you working on now?
At the moment, a few more fables of this sort are coming out, but I'm actually reading 60 books for a prize, which means not being able to write very much at all. Yeah, in fact, it's going to be closer to 90 by the end of it.
What prize?
It's the McKittrick Prize, first novel lists over 40.
Oh.
And some of the books are really long. I mean, they're like 400, 450 pages long. And I'm not a reader of long novels, but it's just, part of the life of being a writer. You do all these things, partly for the money, partly for a sense of solidarity with other writers, partly to discover new talents, etc.
Yeah.
So slowly those stories will come along, and the idea is that they're going to be published in a new Pakistani edition from Karachi. And I think that because one or two of the stories have actually appeared in Pakistan before, I'll be writing new stories to replace them. In one or two cases I already have, and at the moment I'm working with more stories from Attar. And they're mostly stories not about love, but they're about kindness, in fact. And, again, an unconscious sort of pursuit.
After how many pages, when you're judging, I mean, you lose hope about this book?
Shall we give away the trick?
Yeah, please.
Shall I give away the trick? No, the trick that I was taught about 20 years ago when I was judging the Independent Foreign Fiction Prize was read 30 pages. If you don't get on with it, put it away. If two of the other judges really like it, or one other judge feels very strongly about it, then you carry on reading. But if you can't, don't. The other trick, of course, is that most people, once they've decided they don't like a book, are going to pretend they've read it and not read it. So I've realized that I too should try to follow that pursuit. Yeah.
Yesterday we were talking about the kind of fabulaic, almost mythic quality of the work, of the stories, both in your work, Hanan, and in Aamer's work. I'm assuming that in your earlier session, perhaps, you talked about this at greater length.
Yeah,
but could you talk about the fabulaic and the mythic in terms of these stories achieving a kind of universalism or universal quality that in the sense of being applicable to anybody, anywhere?
Well, it doesn't really reply on me, because I mean the book 1001 Night was there and just read it, and I was trying to do the best to tell 19 stories and to stitch them together like a dressmaker, to have a play. The director dramatized my writing. Yeah, but I don't use fable or anything, except one sentence. When my mother told me her life story, she said, the locust and the bird of the king, and that's it. I took it from her. It's a proverb in Lebanese, yeah.
I have a response to that, Hanan. Your story, The Keeper of the Virgins, The Guardian of the Virgins.
The Keeper of the Virgins?
Yeah, it has a fable-like feeling to it. Even though it's true, I mean, it talks to the hermitage.
Yes, you're right. Yeah. The Keeper of the Virgins.
Also, the Arabian Nights. What made you choose those 19 stories? Why did you, earlier you said you played little tricks and changed them round a bit. There is that inventiveness. Every time a story is retold, if it belongs to, if it's part of the common treasury of folklore, you feel tempted to tweak it around a little bit to suit that particular moment. So by doing that, you have actually,
Yeah.
you
I'm
become
hap-
Sherazade yourself while you
I'm
tell the
happy to
Sherazades.
know that now. The new Shahrazad. Yeah.
So I would say that that is the truth. What draws me to fable? I've always been drawn to fable. I think Jana, who was speaking yesterday in this room, talked about Hans Christian Andersen and his impact on her, I think, the Danish fairy tale, writer of fairy tales. I read him when I was very young because I was mostly brought up on English books. But then the other thing is that, of course, people in one's family are constantly telling stories. And Fawzia Afzal Khan is not here, but she was talking about cliches earlier. Of course, there is this cliche that we are told stories by our great aunts and so on. I actually did have a storytelling great aunt. I mean, she would tell stories while we were fasting. And sort of an hour before the fast, she would say she was going to go and say her prayers. And then she said after sunset, she wouldn't tell the story. So we were hanging on for about 3-4 days to hear a dastan, to hear a long story. And I think that that must have had an influence. I mean, sometimes in the middle of one of my stories, somebody breaks away from a realist narrative and starts recounting an old story or remembers something. So sometimes there's a juxtaposition or a splicing of the modern with the old-fashioned or the traditional.
Can you talk a little bit about why you think that the power that has over you or on audiences?
Yeah, I was discussing this with Marina Warner at a conversation we were having, because Marina Warner, of course, is an expert on the fairy tale and so on and so forth. And I said that, well, and there was I think she was called Kelly Page. She was a sci-fi fairy tale writer with us on a platform. And this came up and Marina asked me a question about it. And I said, well, sometimes I suppose if one is describing one's process, the mundane is broken up by a fairy tale or a fable or a parable that's stitched into the fabric of what you're working with. And she sort of got very upset because she thought I was criticizing the mundane. I wasn't. I was saying that the mundane sometimes reveals in its own texture elements of fable, elements of magic, elements of the mystic or whatever you care to call it. All those words are so overdetermined. That's the problem with them. All you can do is actually introduce them into the text and make somebody sit up and wonder that things like that can explode in our rather difficult lives as well. I mean, we talked about the man who stood still being, having the shadow of the lovers, Layla Majnun on it, but it's also, in the middle of the story, there's a long realist story about a refugee boy.
Yes.
Again, he could be from Iraq, he could be from Syria, he could be from Afghanistan, he could even be from Pakistan.
Yeah, and also the fables. I mean, we're teaching people long time ago storytelling. They were teaching people how to live, how to think, what is bad. This is away from religion.
Yeah.
What's bad, what is good, how to be, respectful to everyone and to treat everyone justly.
Yeah.
I mean, in a sense, the fable, like the form of the fable, takes you from the concrete to some kind of abstract, general truth or general lesson or general advice
Absolutely, yeah.
of some kind. Except that in your stories, you lead us to that, and you don't give us the lesson. You allow us to infer the lesson from the narrative itself.
I'm very glad you said that. I'm very glad, Hanan, thank you for bringing that point up. Because people keep asking, what do I do with the stories from Maulana Rumi? Or what do I do with the stories from Attar? What do I change? Or here and there I add a line, I put in a window, or I put in a door, or I put in a suicide or something. But I strip away those morals. Because Maulana, God bless his soul, has this habit of spelling out the moral at the end of the story at great length. And I feel the story itself should give us that moral, or we should be able to add that. So maybe that's the postmodern element in rewriting those fables.
I think actually we have about 15 minutes. Can we open up to questions?
I'd love to.
Yeah?
I'd love to have questions.
For questions, for you.
Yeah.
Questions from the audience?
Yes, please. Are there mics? Are there roving mics?
Yeah, there's a mic.
I think I'll go and sit there. You'll have the question for you. Yeah. Oh.
Hello.
Where is she? She wants me to answer questions.
Yeah?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So I wanted to, so as a writer, I'm sure, considering there's so many writers who've written such excellent, long, lengthy novels, So do you ever have that? I have two questions. So do you ever have this crisis where you feel like just because your story is short, it may not be as good, or maybe it's not saying as much? A, that, and B, who might have inspired you? For instance, like I love Raymond Carver's short stories. He's one of the writers I've read and one of my favorite writers. So as a short story writer, who do you think has inspired you to use this form of writing?
As a short story writer, look, when I began, I was very inspired by writers from the American South, Eudora Welty, Tennessee Williams in particular, Catherine Ann Porter, from elsewhere, Catherine Mansfield. As I went along, as I said, I started to read more and more writings from Asia. So Tanizaki, for the slightly more fabulous element in the stories. A Chinese writer called Lu Xun for dry realism, which I started off with. I was very, very much, a realist writer. I was too scared to work with fable when I began. From my contemporaries, Hanan short stories, I always love reading them. There's always something that, just kind of spurs me on to write a story. My all-time favorite stories, I think I can't think of anything that I love more than two of Qurratul and Haidar's short stories. In English, they translate as Exiles and The Sound of Falling Leaves. In Urdu, they're Jalawatan and Pachhad Ki Awaaz. But even the translations, because she did one of them herself, is brilliant. It's set in London in the 40s. It changes form, it moves away, it breaks all the rules of the short stories. It ends in the middle of nowhere on a poetic note with Eastern European refugees passing a church. And the other one is so tight and so hard. It's about partition, actually, but it's also about women living on the edge. They're just absolutely brilliant. So I think those two stories are stories I turn to all the time when I feel kind of deprived of nourishment, fictional nourishment. And then, of course, I read a lot of this stuff, the poetry that's mystic poetry that's teaching stories and parables and so on as well.
And the first part of her question, do you feel...
do I feel? No. If I write a story in 3 lines, I feel, God, I've really, achieved something. The problem, of course, is how many of these are you going to have to write before you fulfill your reader's demand for a book, Agli kitab kab hone wali. That also is there. You think, God, I'm going to need 101 of these or something like that. So I'm so delighted that my publisher, who's a poet herself, took this risk and produced this little book with photographs in it and very short stories. So, yes.
There's a question
There's
there,
one there,
behind and here.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Why did you write in Urdu? She actually said, "Tum Urdu mein likhte ho." I call the essay, "Tum kyun nahi likhte." That was a look in her eyes. Yeah. Yes. Yes, I did write 5 stories. It's amazing. I always admired people like Beckett who did it. Annie Qurratul and Haider herself wrote beautifully in English as well. People often translate themselves. Nabokov, of course, moved from Russian to English. But actually, working with both hands is something I've always admired and always wished I could do. Now, my dear friend Hanan al-Shaykh says she can't do it, but she does. When the time comes, she writes in English as well. I rang her up one day and I said, you were telling me this story about your teachers. Can you write it for me? And she said, yeah. And I said, shall I come with a tape and, just do an interview? She says, no. I said, you'll write it in Arabic and get it translated? She said, just wait. And 3 days later, she rings me up and she says, it's done. And there it was in English. I think it was because she had already narrated it in English to me that, it became so easy for her to do. Really easy. I think she did it in the night. It was beautiful, you need no editing. I think it's wonderful to be able to write in both languages. And people say you should be a slave to one language and so on and so forth. I don't really think so. If you feel a loyalty to a language, then I think you should stay with that. But if you have any reason to move between languages, please do. And I think that if I had a loyalty to a language, it would be to Urdu. English came to me because I was forced to study English at the age of 4 and a half. And I can express myself in many, many ways in English that I probably still can't in Urdu. But I do want to keep on writing in both.
Fair enough. Question here and behind this one.
Does you wanting to write fables say something about your obsession with your nativity or identity?
No, no,
search for that
no,
poetic
no.
loss?
No. I wish I could say it did. Obviously, the connection is there because what I read a lot of, I mean, because I love reading in Persian and in Urdu. Somebody has just given me a Punjab ki Lok Dastan in Faisalabad, which I'm just longing to read. It just so happens, and I think Hanan will agree, that though we love fairy tales, folk tales, fables, oral narratives from everywhere, perhaps our own narratives, I mean, when you go to the Arabian Nights, they tell you truths about your history that are probably more resonant, you know? So something in cold Denmark might not have quite the same resonance. But I have made an experiment of taking a Finnish story and turning it into an Indian story, which was about the man who shoots a wolf and comes home and finds his wife dying. It's in Kakistan. It was one of the earliest stories I wrote. And I started to write, and I realized I couldn't write a Finnish story. So it became Indian, and the wolf became a tiger. And I knew the place it was set in. It was Rewa in central India, close to where my mother comes from, where I partly grew up. I didn't grow up in Rewa. I used to spend holidays with my grandmother in Indore. So that's why I go back to fables that belong to my heritage, because I can see the landscape. Like, you know, just the other day, driving from Islamabad to Faisalabad and then from Faisalabad back to Lahore. I could actually see landscapes that I hadn't actually experienced, but I know that they're there in my stories already. And immediately I was drawn back to those. So there's a physicality in those stories that draws me, I think.
Questions?
And yes, I mean, in all fairness, I do believe there are alternative modes of storytelling. Those modes are not tied to the creative writing workshop short story that you're taught to write. And I like to dabble with all of those. Yeah. Not early, all throughout. I mean, like I read Nazami's, I have to pick out seven forms when I was well into my 30s. Yeah. Yeah, you know, I used to keep a book of Sadi's by my bedside because I was told it makes you sweet-tongued. But actually, those fables have not influenced me. I don't know the reason. Attar, yes. Nizami, yes. And Jami and Rumi. Yeah, all these. But not Sadi. Yeah, no, well, I would say that more recently I've been influenced by Buddhist fables. The Jatak, which are very closely Panchatantra and Jatak, like the swan's wife, you know. The original swan comes from a Buddhist fable, but actually the version I have is from a Punjabi series called Raja Rasala. So they're just great fun to read, and when you read them, you just feel like creating another version of the same thing. You know. You find the resonance. I find the resonance with it.
Yes, but not everybody can do it quite as well as you do. So,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, I was going to say, the cultural historian Hayden White once said that the one thing we all have in common across cultures and across history is the telling of stories. And it is, in fact, the telling of stories that in some ways brings us together. And the fable is perhaps the most culturally abstracted form of a story, and at the same time also embedded in the culture in which that fable arises. So in the process of adapting a fable, you are in some ways taking one culture, an idea or a sensibility from one culture, and transforming it into something for another culture. Do you do that? Do you think of that consciously when you work?
I probably have done that in the past, as in the story of the tiger, the tigress, yeah. But not now. Now they just come. They just say something to me. Or it could just be as simple as, you know, somebody asked me a really complex question in Faisalabad about writing, you know, taking something from Maulana Rumi, and he says, well, we call him this and you call him that. And I said, no, I don't call him that, actually. And, you know, this is for Western readers. That makes Rumi palatable for Western readers. But no, I suddenly thought later on, you know, the answers come to you later. I wrote those because a lovely person in Karachi said, would I write something folkloric? And I happened to be reading a book of, I think it's called 10 Paths to the Sun in French or something. And these stories were there and they inspired me. So it was literally to answer a question. So they were obviously in my conscious mind. And I wrote them down. So.
Anything?
Yeah, of course, please.
Tell us a little bit about the actual mechanics of the creative process. You know, how do you write? When do you write? What do you do when you feel demonized by your writings? When there's, you know, what you need to write but you can't? Because I know that you've also taught creative writing. Did that hamper
I
your
taught
process?
literature to creative writing students, but yes, I supervised creative writing MAs and PhDs. Look, writing this regular column for Dawn has taught me a lot about discipline, because I wake up when I wake up, and the column is usually, you know, on my mind. So it could be 6 or 7 in the morning, 1 cup of tea, write 1 draft straight through until it's finished. It could take an hour and a half or so, and then revise it, you know, at length that afternoon. So it's usually done. So I guess when fiction's in my mind, I do it the same way. I get up in the morning and just do it. But fiction, I have a complete lack of discipline in the sense that I do just let it grab me whenever it does. And luckily at 63, I have enough time to steal an hour or 2 in the day. I'm going to be 63 in 2 months. Steal an hour or 2 of the day and do it. At least get 1 draft done, especially these short stories. The editing process is meticulous. I will write the story, then I'll do an edit, then sometimes, you know, a good friend will read it and answer questions more about the content, whether something has come through, whether something's clear, whether something's overstated. So, you know, for example, Hanan might say, like she certainly would have done 20 years ago, you said too much in that passage. And I might immediately look at it and think, okay, I'll chuck this out. Or I might argue and fight like my wonderful editor, who is another close friend of both of us, who died, Michael Stoop, also Lebanese, would sometimes tell me, that's too heavy about a certain phrase. Yeah, she's a publisher, so she would say, that's too heavy, and I learned to listen to her at times. Other times I would argue. But, so yeah, the editing is meticulous. It can take ages. I can keep saying, even to a publisher who's accepted a story, please wait, I'm going to do another draft. So can I polish even at the last minute? Motivation isn't there most of the time. I mean, there are always stories hanging around in my head. But if you ask me if I'm dying to sit down and write at the moment, I'd say only my column's on my brain and it's already late. And it's going to be about Shah Abdul Latif Bhittai. But yeah, no, I'm not. I mean, I love life too much, for example. I mean, my writing is on the margins of my life. My life is not on the margins of my writing. And I think the minute you start to, I don't know, I speak for myself. If I started to live only a writer's life, I wouldn't have anything to write about. I would go around in circles and repeat the same things. It derives very much from real people's lives and needs. Even the fables. When somebody asked me in Faisalabad, do you think that writing fables is like kisi kamre mein akele baith ke bansuri bajana? You know, it's like sitting in a room and playing the flute alone. I just fell apart laughing. You know. I said, for example, one thing is if you don't like the sound of the flute, you can shut your ears. But actually, writing is silent. It's completely silent. It doesn't disturb anyone unless they read it out loud, you know, to themselves. So, yeah, I think that one has to be humble or modest. Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
I mentioned a few. I think you came in late. So, I mean, starting from the beginning, it would go like Taniz Zaki, Lucian, Pramudya Anantator, Quratul and Heather. Before that, Catherine Ann Mansfield, Catherine Mansfield, Catherine Ann Porter, Eudora Welty, Tennessee Williams. After that, did I mention Quratul and Heather already? I like Ghulam Abbas. Yeah. And from my contemporaries, I like Hanan's work very much. I like the work of the poet Mimi Khalbati, who's of Iranian birth. We talk a lot about form and metaphor and so on. She's a poet, I'm a short story writer, but we often find ourselves on very close tracks. In fact, I mean, she's written something on the back of it.
Yes. I have one question.
Yeah.
So you've taken the epigraph for the book, for the collection from Isaac Dinesen.
Yeah,
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, she's a great favorite. Yeah, I love Isaac Dinesen. But she writes very long stories. So.
Yeah. Would you like to read it?
And of course, it's got the G word in it, doesn't it?
We have an announcement to make. The next session.
Yeah, we're almost done. So.
I know, just an announcement. The next session has been cancelled, so you guys can ask even more questions.
Okay.
Thank you.
Open workshop. Nobody has seen the trekking birds take their wing towards such warmer spheres as do not exist, or rivers break their course through rocks and plains to run into an ocean which is not to be found. For God does not create a longing or a hope without having a fulfilling reality ready for them. But our longing is our pledge, and blessed are the homesick, for they shall come home. Now this is a Danish writer, but the thing is that Innocent lived for a very long time in Kenya, and she was mad about the 1001 Nights. She used to call herself Sherzad. Yeah. So, she sort of brought in this kind of what we might want to call a Sufi element into that. But there's also a beautiful line from a Persian poet, which I've often used in my writing. When the birds have gone off in search of a body of water, which is a blue direction, it's a verbal pun in Farsi. Why should I stop? Why should I stop? Yeah.
So the question I had in relation to your story, Sandhya, so the line, for God does not create a longing or a hope without having a fulfilling reality ready for them, is that, do you see that in your stories? Do you see that you create a longing and a hope, but you do not actually fulfill those longings or those hopes in the stories? Do you?
That's the hope that keeps you going. Like, friends of mine who go home all the time, and are asked, why do you have this nostalgia for your roots? Why do you return? Why this coming back and so on? They say, no, it's not a going back, it's a going forward. Mimi says that all the time. And that's what Pakistan is like for me. I'm always going to today and tomorrow's Pakistan, not to yesterday's Pakistan. I never came to Lahore as a child. I love being here. I would come back anytime you called me. And I still feel at home, but it's not to do with my past, it's to do with my present. So that in itself is the fulfillment of that pledge, isn't it? I think.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Aamer.